non-proliferation, and many other areas as well. Now, I'm not a dreamer. It is obvious that there will be fundamental issues on which we disagree. We have to insist, for example, that Russia fully complies with its international obligations, including respecting the territorial integrity and political freedom of its neighbors. But we cannot let those areas of disagreement poison the whole relationship. So my message to the Russian leadership and people is clear. Let us build trust on cooperation and base our cooperation on shared interests.
Well, relations between Russia and NATO have been strained since the five-day war between Russia and Georgia in August last year. Russia's recognition of the breakaway Georgian regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia triggered the worst tension in almost 2 decades between the Kremlin and the West. It also alarmed some of Russia's neighbours. Many of these countries are NATO members. They're now concerned that better relations between Moscow and NATO could come at their expense. Well, let's go back to our guests to discuss that further. If I could come to you, Daniel Korski, this idea of a strategic partnership with Russia, how would that work exactly?
I mean, first of all, it's important to recognize that the new NATO Secretary General is sort of following in the US President's lead. Barack Obama started this process of reaching out to the Russian leadership, resetting the relationship famously between the US and Russia. And in a sense, the NATO Secretary General is following through. And what we saw here was the NATO chief saying some of the areas that could be a basis for collaboration. Counterterrorism is one, cooperation in Afghanistan, perhaps not through Russian forces in Afghanistan, but certainly perhaps assistance to some kind of development effort, transit agreement so that NATO forces can transport equipment through Russian territory. And of course there remains this large question that the NATO Secretary General didn't mention explicitly, but is vexing many minds in the West, which is Iran, and how to get Russia to help NATO and the NATO alliance deal with the threat that Iran could potentially pose or poses.
Just initially to go back to the former Soviet satellite states, I mean, some of them are quite worried about this new détente with Russia. I mean, are they right to think that it could be at their expense?
I mean, they're particularly concerned following the war over Georgia. I don't think they're right to be concerned about military action. I don't think Moscow currently has any plans or any intentions to exercise its military power. But it is true that the Russian leadership has in the past been willing to use all sorts of other kind of shall we say, tools of power to get their way in the eastern neighborhood. Energy being one tool, but another being cyber attacks. And Estonia, a NATO member, was under a ferocious cyber attack just a few years ago. Suspected of emanating from Russia and indeed being controlled by the Moscow leadership. So they have reason to be concerned about certain Russian actions, but not to see Russia as a strategic threat or indeed as a country willing to use military force directly on them. No.
Inderjit Palmer, would you agree with that assessment? And do you think there is a possibility of a common agenda between NATO and Russia?
I think on a fairly sort of limited range of issues. And possibly not in great depth, there probably is. But I think there is a necessity to also see that there are some fundamental conflicts of interest between NATO and expanding NATO and Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev, former Soviet president, himself pointed out that there was quite an understanding between the United States and the Russians in the 1990s that NATO would not expand into the former Soviet territories. And there's a clear feeling amongst quite a large swathe of opinion in Russia that NATO is doing just that, and that there is a sort of encirclement policy in operation once again. So although there can be some levels of tactical cooperation, I suspect that there are large numbers of people who think that there's going to be some fundamental conflicts which could be quite serious in the future.
Doug Barndo, do you think that's right, that the expansion of NATO is partly what, the source of the conflict here between Russia and NATO?
Well, certainly. I mean, the Russians are not stupid. From their standpoint, it's hard to see the expansion of NATO as anything except an expansion of alliance directed against them. And, if you simply look at the territory, from their standpoint, Georgia and the borders, territories matter a lot more to them than to Western Europe and certainly to the United States. So I think they do feel betrayed. I mean, there's an argument about whether that was ever promised, but you can certainly see the Russian standpoint. The Cold War ends without a shot, war is avoided, the Red Army recedes, and lo and behold, the Western alliance expands. I do think the West needs to take that into account and ask, is this really worth it? And frankly, what is the purpose of NATO? The purpose of NATO originally was to defend against the Soviet Union. Should NATO, in fact, expand into territory that not only was part of the Soviet Union, but frankly part of the Russian Empire? That raises real questions about what the alliance is about. I think that needs to be taken into account. Russia matters. There are a lot of issues from North Korea to Iran to terrorism where they can be helpful. To the extent we manage to antagonize them, we may lose cooperation on some very important issues.
Just on that very point, NATO's new Secretary-General has also said he thinks it's about time that NATO had a new strategic concept. The last time NATO drew up an overall strategy was in 1999, well before today's global challenges, as we're talking about just now, like terrorism, cyber attacks and piracy in Somalia. They've also become NATO's concern. Rasmussen has appointed former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright to head a committee of 12 experts debating NATO's future strategy. They'll discuss challenges that NATO will face over the next decade and how it should respond to them. The final approval of the new strategy is expected at the Alliance's next summit in Lisbon late next year. Inderjit Palmer, do you think that, what does this concept of a strategic concept need to be, and how detailed does it have to be?
Well, it's interesting that Madeleine Albright is chairing the committee to develop the concept. Madeleine Albright is a champion of democratization, democracy promotion since she was a Secretary of State under the Clinton administration, and even earlier than that. She's also somebody who's championed the Council for Community of Democracies. So I suspect that the strategic concept that NATO, which it has in effect already been using for a decade or more, I suspect is going to be democracy promotion, and some of the elements and components that go along with that. There'll be struggle for hearts and minds, for example, probably a degree of nation building, and that kind of thing. Many of those are key elements of democracy promotion.
Can I bring in Daniel Korski? What do you think? And when should NATO be taking the lead? And is that what this document needs to set out? What does it need to do, really, to kind of focus minds?
It needs to be NATO's strategic blueprint for a new era. What is it the alliance is for? What can we agree on? And what should NATO leave to others? I don't agree that NATO is going to take on the challenge of democratization or nation building. I think in many ways a lot of people are going to counsel that this strategic concept shouldn't be too ambitious, that the era for grand ambition is probably drawing to a close. But instead I think it's going to have a real trouble, real difficulty bridging over the sort of three different parts that now make up NATO. Some countries who fear, as we said earlier, Russia, some countries who want to fight in places like Afghanistan, and a third category of countries who basically just want to keep their heads down and don't want to be bothered, don't want to spend money on defense, don't want to send their troops anywhere. And so the concept for it to make sense needs to both talk about threats but also bind these three different camps inside the NATO alliance together.
Doug Bondo, do you think the US should still be part of NATO?
Well, I think the U.S. should raise the question, what is America's role these days? And if there's a threat, why aren't the Europeans capable of dealing with it, at least in terms of Russia? I'm concerned about the division within Europe itself. I think, as expressed earlier, there clearly are varying degrees within Europe of a willingness to use military force. We're going to see a challenge even for Great Britain, which has been one of the most willing to partner with the U.S. in terms of its military budget. A lot of discussions about the future of its nuclear deterrent, future of its military budget. And it's not clear to me what NATO's role is today. It had a clear role during the Cold War, but today it's not so clear. And I think the idea of expanding membership, for example, to a country like Georgia makes countries less secure rather than more secure by bringing them into potential conflict with Russia. So it's not obvious to me what that role is. NATO is predominantly a military alliance. What is that alliance supposed to do? Things like nation building and other proposals don't work very well, I think, for that alliance. And can that military alliance survive if the Europeans in general, if not every country, but in general are moving away from stronger militaries and a willingness to use military action? So I think there really needs to be a more fundamental discussion about NATO's role in a post-Cold War world where the European Union itself has 10 times the GDP of Russia, the most obvious threat. It's not clear to me what that alliance with the United States then should be doing in today's world.
Inderjit Palmer, would you agree with that it's sort of the mandate isn't really clear and that needs to be outlined?
Well, I think that's right. It is correct that